The city had worn Elias Thornton down to a shadow of himself. The endless hum of traffic, the clamor of voices, and the relentless pace had frayed his nerves until he could barely think straight. He'd always found peace in the quiet act of fishing, the gentle cast of a line into still water, the patient wait for a tug. It was his sanctuary, his way of stitching himself back together. When he left the urban sprawl behind and moved to the rural outskirts of Willow Creek, a small town nestled in the rolling hills of the Midwest, he knew exactly where he'd go first. Hollow Lake, a secluded spot he'd discovered as a teenager. Hollow Lake wasn't on any map. It lay hidden in a dense forest, a 40-minute hike from the nearest dirt road. The locals rarely spoke of it, and those who did mentioned it in hushed tones, as if the lake held secrets better left undisturbed. Elias didn't care about the rumors. To him, it was a place of solitude, a refuge where the world's noise couldn't reach. He remembered sneaking off to the lake as a kid, his fishing rod slung over his shoulder, the quiet of the forest wrapping around him like a warm blanket. It was where he'd go to escape his parents' arguments, schoolyard bullies, or just the weight of being young and unsure. On a humid July afternoon, Elias decided to revisit Hollow Lake. He didn't tell anyone where he was headed, and there was no need. His new life in Willow Creek was solitary, just the way he liked it. He parked his truck at the edge of an old logging trail, grabbed his tackle box and rod, and started the trek through the woods. The path was overgrown, vines snaking across the ground, but the familiar rhythm of the hike calmed him. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant call of a hawk. When he emerged from the trees, Hollow Lake spread before him, its surface smooth as polished obsidian. It was smaller than he remembered, maybe 100 yards across, ringed by towering pines that cast long shadows over the water. The stillness was profound, broken only by the occasional ripple of a fish breaking the surface. Elias set up his gear on a flat rock by the shore, baited his hook, and cast his line. The plop of the lure hitting the water was the only sound in the world. He settled onto the rock, letting the silence wash over him. For the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe. An hour passed, maybe two. The sun climbed higher, its heat pressing against his skin. Elias was lost in the rhythm of casting and reeling when he noticed a flicker of movement across the lake. At first, he thought it was a deer or a fox, but as he squinted through the haze, he saw it. A figure standing on the opposite shore, half hidden by the trees. The person was tall, motionless, their silhouettes stark against the green. Elias raised a hand in a tentative wave, but the figure didn't respond. They just stood there, watching. Unease prickled at the back of his neck. Hollow Lake was too remote for casual visitors. Most people didn't even know it existed. He tried to shrug it off. Maybe it was another fisherman, someone who'd stumbled across the lake by chance. But the figure didn't move, didn't cast a line, didn't do anything but stare. Elias shifted on the rock, his fishing rod forgotten in his hands. The air felt heavier now, the silence less comforting. The figure began to move, stepping out from the trees and walking slowly along the shore. As they drew closer, Elias could make out details. A man older than him, maybe in his 50s, wearing a worn flannel shirt and a battered straw hat. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. He carried no gear, no rod, just his hands stuffed deep in his pockets. Elias's pulse quickened. Something about the man's deliberate pace, the way he kept his eyes fixed on Elias, felt wrong. "Hey," Elias called, forcing a smile. "Nice day, huh? You fishing?" The man didn't answer. He stopped about 20 yards away, standing at the water's edge, his gaze unwavering. The silence stretched, thick and oppressive. Elias's mouth went dry. He glanced at his tackle box, wondering if he should pack up and leave, but the thought of turning his back on the man made his skin crawl. He cast his line again, trying to act casual, but his hands were shaking. Minutes dragged by. The man didn't move. Elias could feel the weight of his stare, like a physical pressure against his chest. Finally, the man spoke, his voice low and gravelly, cutting through the stillness like a blade. "You shouldn't be here." Elias froze. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made his stomach lurch. He turned to face the man, his heart pounding. "What did you say?" The man didn't repeat himself. Instead, he took a step closer, his boots sinking into the soft earth by the shore. His hand moved to his pocket, and Elias caught a glint of something metallic. A knife, maybe, or worse. Panic surged through him. He dropped his rod, the reel clattering against the rock, and stood, his legs unsteady. "I'm just fishing," Elias said, his voice cracking. "I'm not hurting anyone." The man's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. "You don't understand," he said. "This place doesn't let you go." Before Elias could respond, the man lunged forward, moving faster than Elias thought possible. Instinct took over. Elias turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches snapping against his arms. He didn't look back, didn't stop to see if the man was following. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees looming like silent sentinels. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. The trail back to his truck felt endless, every step a battle against the tangled roots and vines. When he finally stumbled onto the dirt road, he fumbled with his keys, his hands slick with sweat. He threw himself into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and peeled out, the tires kicking up gravel. The man's words echoed in his mind. "This place doesn't let you go." When Elias reached his small rental house in Willow Creek, he locked the doors and checked every window. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He sat on the couch, staring at the wall, trying to convince himself it was just a weird encounter, nothing more. But as night fell, he heard it, a faint rustling outside like footsteps on the gravel driveway. He held his breath, listening. The sound stopped, then started again, closer now. "Elias," a voice whispered, so soft he wasn't sure he'd heard it. It came from just outside the front door. He didn't move. The voice came again, low and insistent. "You can't leave." Elias grabbed his phone and dialed 911, his voice trembling as he explained what had happened. The dispatcher was calm, promising to send a patrol car. But by the time the police arrived, there was no one outside. They searched the property, the woods, even drove out to Hollow Lake, but found nothing. No man, no knife, no sign of anyone. The officers were skeptical, suggesting it might have been a prank or a misunderstanding. But Elias knew what he'd seen, what he'd heard. He never went back to Hollow Lake. The thought of it made his skin crawl. But the lake wasn't done with him. Late at night, when the house was quiet, he'd hear the whispers again, faint and distant, calling his name. Sometimes in the corner of his eye, he'd catch a glimpse of a shadow moving just beyond the window, a figure in a flannel shirt watching. Nathan Cole had always been the adventurous one in the family, the one who'd drag his younger brother Owen on wild escapades. Fishing was their thing, a tradition they'd started as kids on the muddy banks of the local creek. When Nathan bought a boat, a sleek second-hand cruiser he'd saved years for, They knew it was time for a proper adventure. They planned a 4-day trip to Blackthorn Reservoir, a sprawling body of water in the heart of the Ozarks, far from their hometown's bustle. It was meant to be a brother's getaway, a chance to reconnect, drink a few beers, and catch some fish. They invited 2 friends along. Marcus, a quiet mechanic with a dry sense of humor, and Leo, a boisterous bartender who could make anyone laugh. The 4 of them set out on a crisp September morning, the air sharp with the promise of fall. Nathan piloted the boat, grinning as the wind whipped through his hair. The reservoir was vast, its surface shimmering under the sun, surrounded by jagged cliffs and dense forests. They felt like explorers charting unclaimed territory. The first day was perfect. They anchored in a secluded cove, cast their lines, and pulled in a few bass. Leo cracked open a cooler of beers, and they swapped stories as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the water gold. The boat had a small cabin, so they didn't need to rough it on shore. As night fell, they sat on the deck, the stars bright above, the only sounds the gentle lapping of water and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was around midnight when Owen noticed the lights. At first, he thought they were stars reflecting on the water. But they were too steady, too close. He nudged Nathan, pointing to a small raft drifting toward them, its outline barely visible in the dark. 2 figures sat aboard, illuminated by a single lantern that cast eerie shadows across their faces. "Hey, you guys see that?" Owen asked, his voice low. Nathan squinted into the darkness. "Yeah, what are they doing out here?" The raft drew closer, moving silently across the water. Marcus stood, his hand resting on the railing. "Maybe they're lost," he said, but his tone was uneasy. Nathan, ever the optimist, leaned over the side and waved. "You folks okay out there?" The figures didn't respond. As the raft came within a few yards, Owen could make them out. 2 men, one older with a grizzled beard, the other younger, his face obscured by a hood. They weren't fishing, weren't doing much of anything, just sitting there staring. "We're out of fuel," the older man said finally, his voice flat, like he was reading from a script. "And food." Nathan frowned but nodded. "All right, hang on. We've got some extra." He rummaged through the storage compartment, pulling out a small gas can and a bag of jerky. Owen caught Marcus's eye, and they exchanged a look. Something about the men felt off, their stillness, their lack of expression. Nathan handed over the supplies, leaning over the side to pass them to the raft. The younger man took them without a word, his hands gloved despite the mild night. "Where are you headed?" Nathan asked, trying to keep things friendly. The older man tilted his head, his eyes glinting in the lantern light. "Nowhere," he said. "Just drifting." The raft turned and glided away, the lantern's glow fading into the darkness. The brothers and their friends stood in silence, the air thick with unease. Leo tried to laugh it off, cracking a joke about creepy lake hermits, but no one joined in. They went to bed soon after, locking the cabin door behind them. Owen couldn't sleep. The encounter played over in his mind. The men's blank faces, the way they'd stared without blinking. Around 2 a.m., he heard it, a faint hum, like an engine in the distance. He sat up, straining to listen. The sound grew louder and stopped abruptly. He crept to the cabin window, peering out into the dark. Nothing. A thud echoed from the deck above. Owen's heart leapt into his throat. He shook Nathan awake, whispering, "Something's on the boat." They grabbed flashlights and crept upstairs, Marcus and Leo close behind. The deck was empty, but the gas can Nathan had given the men was sitting by the railing, as if it had been placed there deliberately. Owen swept his flashlight across the water and froze. There, at the edge of the beam, were the two men standing on their raft watching. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stared with eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. "Get the hell away from us!" Nathan shouted, his voice shaking. The men didn't respond. Slowly, they turned their raft and vanished into the night. The group checked the boat, their hands trembling as they searched every corner. The spare gas can was empty, and Nathan's wallet was missing from his jacket. They hadn't heard the men board, hadn't heard them leave. No one slept after that. They kept the lights on, the engine idling, and moved the boat to the center of the reservoir. By morning, they were exhausted, their nerves frayed. They headed back to the dock, the trip cut short. None of them spoke much on the drive home, but Owen couldn't shake the feeling that the men hadn't just been thieves. There was something deliberate in their silence, something predatory in their gaze. Weeks later, Owen found himself waking in the middle of the night, certain he'd heard the hum of an engine outside his apartment. He'd checked the windows, but there was never anything there. Still, he couldn't shake the sense that something from Blackthorn Reservoir had followed him home. Clara Vance had grown up listening to her great-uncle Amos tell stories about his fishing days. At 90, he was still spry, his mind sharp as a tack, and his love for fishing undimmed. He'd take Clara to rivers and ponds across the county, teaching her how to bait a hook, how to read the water's currents. But there was one place he never mentioned: Shadow Tarn, a small hidden lake deep in the Appalachian foothills. Clara had heard whispers about it from other locals, tales of strange lights, of people who went missing. But Amos brushed them off, saying it was just old nonsense. So when Amos suggested they fish at Shadow Tarn one August morning, Clara was surprised. "Thought you didn't like that place," she said, watching him pack his tackle box. Amos paused, his hands still. "It's been a long time," he said quietly. "Figure it's time to face it." Clara didn't press him. She figured he had his reasons, and she was just happy to spend the day with him. They drove to a remote trailhead, the road winding through dense forest until it petered out into a gravel path. From there, it was a grueling hike, the trail choked with brambles and fallen logs. Amos moved slowly, leaning on his cane, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the trees as if expecting something to emerge. When they reached Shadow Tarn, Clara's breath caught. The lake was smaller than she'd imagined, its water dark and still, like a sheet of black glass. The surrounding trees were gnarled and twisted, their branches hanging low over the water. There was no birdsong, no hum of insects, just an oppressive silence that made Clara's skin prickle. They launched a small rowboat Amos had hidden in the underbrush, its wood weathered but sturdy. Clara rowed them to the center of the tarn, the oars slicing through the water with barely a sound. Amos was quieter than usual, his usual stories replaced by a tense silence. Clara tried to fill the void, chatting about the weather, the fish they might catch, but Amos barely responded. His eyes were fixed on the water, his hands gripping the boat's edge. "Uncle Amos," Clara said finally, "you sure you're okay?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze stayed on the water, his face pale. "It's still here," he whispered. Clara frowned. "What's still here?" Before he could respond, his fishing rod jerked. He grabbed it, his hands trembling, but he didn't reel in the line. Instead, he leaned over the side, staring into the water. Clara followed his gaze, her heart pounding. At first, she saw nothing but the dark surface. But then, A shadow moved beneath, too large to be a fish. It was vague, humanoid, its edges blurred by the water's depth. Clara gasped, jerking back. What was that? Amos's voice was barely audible. We need to go, now. Clara didn't argue. She grabbed the oars and rowed for shore, her arms burning with the effort. Amos sat rigid, his eyes never leaving the water. When they reached the bank, he climbed out, moving faster than Clara had ever seen. They abandoned the boat, scrambling up the trail as fast as they could. Clara kept looking back, half expecting to see that shadow following them. When they reached the car, Amos collapsed into the passenger seat, his breathing ragged. Clara drove in silence, her mind racing. It wasn't until they were back at Amos's cabin that he spoke again. That tarn, he said, his voice heavy with regret. It's not right. I saw something there when I was young, a shape in the water, like a person, but wrong. I thought it was my imagination, but then a friend of mine went missing. They found his boat, but not him. I swore I'd never go back. Clara's stomach twisted. Why did you take me there? Amos looked at her, his eyes haunted. I thought I could face it, prove it wasn't real. But it is. It's still there, waiting. Clara never went near Shadow Tarn again. But sometimes, late at night, she'd wake to the sound of water lapping against a boat, though her apartment was miles from any lake. And in her dreams, she'd see that shadow moving beneath the surface, its formless face watching her. Lila Harper's father, Benjamin, had always been her rock. Fishing was their bond, a ritual that started when she was 5, sitting on his knee as he taught her to cast. They'd explored every lake in the Pacific Northwest, but Crescent Lake was his favorite. Tucked in a remote valley in Oregon, it was a place of stark beauty, its waters deep and clear, surrounded by rugged cliffs. Benjamin called it his slice of heaven. As Benjamin aged, his trips to Crescent Lake became more frequent, almost obsessive. At 65, he was still fit, his hands steady as he tied his lures. But in the weeks before he disappeared, Lila noticed a change. He was distracted, his eyes distant, as if something was pulling him back to the lake. One October evening, Benjamin called Lila. Heading to Crescent Lake for the weekend, he said, his voice bright but strained. Got a good feeling about this one. Want me to come? Lila asked. Nah, just need some time to think. I'll be back Sunday. That was the last she heard from him. By Monday, when he didn't answer his phone, panic set in. Lila drove to Crescent Lake, her heart pounding. She found his truck at the trailhead, the driver's door ajar. The path to the lake was steep and rocky, but Lila knew it well. When she reached the shore, the lake was still, its surface unbroken. In the distance, she saw Benjamin's boat, anchored in the middle, swaying gently. Lila borrowed a kayak from a nearby campsite and paddled out. The boat was empty, but everything was in place. His rod, his tackle box, a thermos of coffee. It was as if he'd stepped away for a moment. Lila called his name, her voice echoing off the cliffs, but there was no answer. She leaned over the side, peering into the water. It was clear but deep, the bottom invisible. For a moment she thought she saw something, a flicker of movement, a pale shape, but it vanished. She paddled back to shore, her hands shaking, and called the police. The search team arrived at dusk, scouring the lake and the surrounding woods. They found nothing. No sign of Benjamin, no trace of a struggle. The official report called it a drowning, but Lila didn't believe it. Crescent Lake was calm, with no currents to sweep a body away, and Benjamin was too experienced to fall overboard. The dreams started soon after. In them, Lila was on the lake, rowing toward her father's boat. She'd look down and see him beneath the water, his face pale, his eyes pleading. She'd wake gasping. The image burned into her mind. Lila began visiting Crescent Lake alone, sitting on the shore for hours, watching the water. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she couldn't stay away. One night as the moon rose, she heard a whisper. A voice, faint but unmistakable. Lila, it said, coming from the water. She grabbed a flashlight and ran to the shore. There, in the middle of the lake, was her father's boat, drifting closer. A figure stood aboard, silhouetted against the moonlight. It looked like Benjamin, but his movements were wrong. Too stiff, too slow. "Lila," the voice whispered again, closer now. She backed away, her heart racing. The figure raised a hand as if beckoning her, then vanished as the boat reached the shore. Lila fled, driving home in a panic. She hasn't returned to Crescent Lake, but the whispers follow her, calling her name in the quiet moments. She knows something is out there, waiting in the depths, and she fears it's not her father at all. If these chilling tales of Hollow Lake, Blackthorn Reservoir, Shadow Tarn, and Crescent Lake left you uneasy, share them with friends who love a good scare. Stay cautious on your next fishing trip. You never know what's lurking beneath the surface.